Thank you very much, Program Director, and good morning to all the delegates. I noticed as we walked back in that there was a lovely bubble of happiness, which means you enjoyed your coffee break tremendously. So I hope I'm not going to ruin that bubble. I wondered, Chairperson, for quite a few days why you had invited us to this conference. Because we tend to neglect the developing world when we deliberate on science. So I was intrigued, and I'm even more intrigued to be here. So I hope once I've made my few remarks, you will feel that it was worth inviting an African. So it's a great pleasure for me to have the honor to participate in this conference on research integrity. Well, many people talk about us having passed through the golden age of science. But I think one of the things that we would like to deliberate upon as South Africa and the African continent is the question of what is our place in the world of science. We believe that a conference such as this one, focused on research integrity, is a very important conference, an important set of deliberations that you are holding. However, we recognize this importance in a context which acknowledges our concern about the fact that when it comes to science, technology, and innovation, we tend to be subjects rather than participants. And we believe that this condition has to alter fundamentally. And so, as we talk about research integrity, we would like to insert the notion of development within that set of deliberations. Many of us, perhaps some even gathered in this room, have partnerships with colleagues on the African continent. I would presume that it probably would be with some colleagues in South Africa, perhaps a few in Nigeria and Kenya, meaning in the sum total of 54 African countries, there are very few relationships with the African continent. I would presume as well that the nature of the partnership is not one of the African as principal researcher, nor of the African as principal funder. So we tend to have collaboration as somewhat junior partners. So the question would be for us, what is the integrity of the absence of scientific participation at its fullest levels? It's been rare for me to observe, for example, partnerships between ourselves and international collaborators that result in the presence of a permanent, dedicated scientific institution that will produce world-class research from the African continent. So we tend to have partnerships of visits. They're not partnerships of building permanent capacity. And I think as we deliberate upon the question of research integrity and the ethics that we must bring to the work we do as researchers, we should also begin to question the integrity of the absence of scientific development in a large part of the world that is the subject of a lot of the work that we do. So I present that problematique to you, and I hope that at some time As we continue the World Conference on Research Integrity, there will arrive a point at which we insert this concept of integrity and development. And let's see where that might take us. Well, one of the observations that I make as a Minister of Science and Technology is that from around the midpoint of the 1990s, there's been a decline in funding available for science, and that science has become much more complicated to practice. More and more research has moved out of private labs and into universities. There's been a race to sequence the human genome, but this race was not simply a state-sponsored race against another nation, as in the Cold War syndrome. It was a race between the private and the public. It was a race between a US genetic entrepreneur and the publicly funded Human Genome Project. So many of us began to tremble at the prospect of one company owning the building blocks of life. The journey away from that pre-mid-90s golden age of science has continued somewhat into the new millennium. We now have a public United States brain initiative that is deeply rooted in a private initiative that some are saying changes the way science is funded. I'm talking here about billionaires who have a science agenda. Billionaires who appear to be privatizing science. Of course, for us as South Africa, we have many positive things that we say about our experience with one of these foundations, particularly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that have begun to focus on diseases prevalent in the African continent and to support our researchers in seeking effective diagnostic tools and treatments to these diseases that are often neglected in much of our research work and the development of new pharmaceutical products. In fact, we've observed that it has become fashionable for US billionaires to sponsor their own pet science projects. You have Oracle's Ellison, who has taken on molecular biology, or Google's Schmidt, who has his own Oceans Institute, and George Miller, the father of fracking, has built the giant Magellan telescope. We've also had South African billionaires taking an interest in science, more particularly in the space sciences, as well as information technology. But they have not come anywhere close to setting our national science agenda. This is because, as a government, South Africa still funds public research institutes. Unlike some of our more developed partner countries, we've not scaled down the relative importance of public research institutes in our national innovation system. We have a comparatively extensive network of public research institutes in our country, accounting for 19% of the total research and development performance. This is double the contribution you see in the United Kingdom and just slightly lower than the contribution, the proportion in Russia, which has the most extensive network of research institutes in the developed world. When we focus upon the subject of research integrity, we in South Africa have paid particular attention to the Singapore Statement of 2010, which several South African institutions have endorsed. Most of the statement's responsibilities are placed on researchers, but we have acknowledged that there's a role for institutions to play in helping to negotiate conflicts of interest by creating a climate in which professional research integrity is expected. Of course, as many of you would acknowledge, the role of money in science is perhaps as problematic as the role of money in politics, if less easily understood. Sometimes we do get funding that comes without strings attached. At other times, strings are hidden. They're buried and not easily seen by the naked eye. I'm thinking of those very wealthy persons who pursue science and technology projects through free market or conservative think tanks. So it's easy for tobacco, as an earlier speaker said, and energy corporates to pursue their agendas against climate change and renewable energy, while seemingly funding legitimate scientific research. I had experience just recently with these set of conflicting imperatives. I was representing my political party at a fundraising dinner with business. And the business partners or the guests have the right to ask you any question that they wish to ask you. Present in the room was a representative of a tobacco company. And she said, Minister Pandor, I have found your department very hostile toward our company. We actually fund a great deal of research. Are you aware of that? Why would your department be so hostile? So I had to think very quickly. And my response was, well, I don't think they're hostile. It may be that they don't associate with your brand. Her question really, her view was that we are ready to support your department in funding legitimate research agenda projects, but my department probably suspects, as the researchers do, that while funding legitimate research initiatives, they would also be expected to acknowledge that this comes from a company that has questionable commercial practices, which many of our scientists have serious ethical concerns with, particularly given our health promotion agenda. So what these organizations do is support a network of so-called independent-looking organizations which can produce plausible arguments in defense of their positions. And they come to poorly funded departments of science and technology in many of our countries and persuade that actually this research, which talks of less harm, should actually be promoted by our departments that lack resources, that may lack institutional capacity, and that through desperation of resources may take up these opportunities and so confound the attempts that departments of health are trying to make to address very serious health effects of some of these products. So at times, the lack of resources can open up countries' scientists to very questionable partnerships which would militate against pursuing legitimate development objectives. So we have been very concerned about the role of funding in influencing the character of research that is funded in our country. And we believe that a free media can play a very important role in thwarting this form of corporate capture. So one of the things we've begun to get quite involved in is training science communicators to understand science work from support and training by scientists, in order that when they report on this reduction in harm, alcohol, as it's called, or tobacco, or other form of drug, they're able to write from an informed perspective and assist us in thwarting this form of corporate capture in science. In our country, we found that medical research, not very surprisingly, is the vanguard of research integrity. In fact, South Africa runs the longest running National Institutes of Health funded training program for research ethics at master's level, the longest running on the African continent. It's called SARETI, the South African Research Ethics Training Initiative, and it's a flagship African master's program supported with funding by the National Institutes of Health. Our National Health Research Ethics Council has an oversight role and tackles complaints or appeals on ethics. Our National Research Foundation, which is our premier grant-making institution for postgraduate study, is busy preparing a similar oversight role for other research fields in our country. But medical research has gone even beyond these early steps. Rhino Ethics is the most widely used software for ethics review in Africa today. It is affordable, it's created for low bandwidth, and is accepted in 12 countries and 39 committees on the continent. This means that Rhino Ethics has the potential to become a de facto Pan-African platform. If this were to happen, it would create compatibility and comparative performance management across sub-Saharan Africa, a feature that we believe would really help to generate more critical research being done on the African continent. Currently, as I indicated earlier, with about 10% of the world population, Africa attracts only 1% of global clinical trials. Getting more of the global clinical trials funding would be a major asset for us. And creating one Pan-African platform would definitely be a key success factor, we believe, in making this happen. So Rhino Ethics is now developing direct links to medicine regulation and clinical trial software approved by the US Department of Health and Human Sciences. This means it now has the possibility of becoming a major link in accelerating medicine approval across the continent, a notoriously complex issue for us. So, Africa has now, in principle, what it takes to create its own continental software platform for ethics review, and in the near future, to improve and accelerate medicine regulation. We have other initiatives on the continent, like that of CORED, or the Council on Health Research for Development. It has a research fairness initiative that helps shape and monitor international collaborative research and innovation involving low and middle-income countries. This conference's Montreal Statement on cross-boundary research collaboration in 2013 has been central to defining best practice and informs our international science, technology, and innovation partnerships. We've worked actively to ensure that the vital contribution of science, technology, and innovation to eradicate poverty and reinforce international solidarity was recognized in the United Nations formulation of the new Sustainable Development Goals. We also continue to contribute strategically to defending our and Africa's interests in international climate change negotiations. We think climate change is a prime example of a policy domain dependent on sound scientific advice for decision-making, and we have South African expertise on climate change and environment who are valuable resources for our negotiators on climate change. And we play a very active role in supporting policymakers in this regard. We also, as a system, put our science diplomacy to work in support of multilateralism. In this regard, we have two significant international partnerships that we often refer to. DG Robert Jan Smits, who will speak after me, is fully knowledgeable about both of them. They are a significant driving force for Africa's future science, technology, and innovation growth. The first is the decadal 1.4 billion euro European and developing countries clinical trials partnership. Over the past few years, the ECDTP has contributed immensely to accelerating the development of new interventions to fight HIV and AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis, and to enhancing Africa's research capacities in relation to these diseases. The second international partnership that is driving Africa's future growth is the Square Kilometre Array, or SKA. The SKA organization intends to invest approximately 600 million euro for phase 1 construction costs between 2018 and 2023. The European Union has allocated funding of around 5 million euro through its Horizon 2020 program to support the detailed design of the infrastructure required at the two SKA co-host sites, the Murchison region of Australia and the Karoo region of South Africa. So in closing then, what we are proposing is that our point of departure as we deliberate these matters should be about Africa owning and setting the agenda and also fostering strong international partnerships for mutual benefit. African countries, of course, must invest more in science, technology, and innovation, in their universities, but more resources must also be matched with a commitment toward building and strengthening higher education systems in ways that genuinely contribute to economic and political development, as well as the alleviation of poverty and disease. We also believe a strong challenge for Africa is the need to ensure that the gender imbalance in the practice of science, technology, and innovation activities is addressed, not just through appointing female ministers of science and technology, but through ensuring that women who are the majority in the world are the majority leading scientists in the world and in Africa. We believe that the involvement of women in science activities is absolutely critical to African development. So given all these issues that impinge on our intention to develop science, technology, and innovation on the African continent, how do your considerations on integrity and ethical practices impact on our imperatives? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for that inspiring address, and you could judge from the reaction how it went down. So are there any questions that anyone wishes to ask the Minister, or observations, comments? Again, if you would move to the microphones. If not, I think you raised the issue of public communications, and this is something that I think all universities struggle with, because we all want to spin up our discoveries and so on. But that could also be misleading the public. How do you see that as an issue of integrity?
Well, I think what you need to do is firstly look at who's developing the communication and what is the to what degree are scientists involved in developing the communication. We've had a lot of debate about biotechnology in South Africa, about some of the treatments that are developed, as well as in the agricultural sector, some of the practices with respect to GMOs and so on. So we decided that we would develop a public communication program, because there was an uproar, both in Parliament by members from particular perspectives, right and left, as well as the public. So we put a team of experts together with journalists and worked on a communication program through town hall meetings, articles written by experts and so on. And what we did as we began the work was do a test as to people's understanding and views on biotechnology. And discovered there's actually a lot of assumptions, but very little informed knowledge. So our communication program was directed at really correcting impressions people had about harm and so on, and also providing information about what we're supporting and what is being done. 3 years down the line, so we've had quite an extensive program. We just reported this year on a second test following the interventions. And it's quite incredible how much more deep understanding of biotechnology has developed, and the community's appreciation for the kinds of steps that we have taken. So I think you have to be fairly deliberate. It has to be a partnership between experts, scientists, as well as government, but the public media, the media, should not be left out of the equation.
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Mona Nasser. I'm a lecturer from Plymouth University. Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk, and I love the part how you explained the importance of how private corporatization is affecting the research community in South Africa. And my understanding from some of the papers I've read that there is also a problem that they skew the research agenda, because they not only researchers who get funding from them do research that would fit that agenda, but also those who don't get funding, and they hope they get funding. And I'm wondering how you see, or what are your thoughts about how to manage that from a policy or cultural level, manage this situation to ensure that the research agenda is not skewed to the pet interests of private corporations.
Well, one of the things that we've been encouraging countries to do on the continent is firstly to develop a policy on science, technology, and innovation. Because in the absence of a policy, it's very difficult to interface with any grant-making institution. So it's very important that they're clear on what their policy perspective is. And then the second is to also ensure that you have robust institutions that are able to be the interlocutor with funders of any guise. And I don't, in any way believe the foundations shouldn't be there and shouldn't support science. I think they have a very important role. The problem is where there's abuse or where there's neglect of engaging with the research system in a country and you actually impose an agenda. That, I think, would be a problem. But if you have appropriate institutional capability, if you have well-resourced institutional bodies, such as we have a National Research Foundation with very good capabilities, so they can play a very strong role in articulating a national research agenda and ensuring smooth collaboration with institutions. And then, of course, less driving by us, as the minister said earlier, and more by the scientists. It's institutions and scientists who must form the relationships, but we must ensure that there isn't abuse of our countries, but there's a role we play to ensure we provide appropriate support, policy instruments, proper institutional capacity in order to ensure that there isn't the kind of concern I have alluded to.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Minister. You've put a number of ideas, thought-provoking, and we want to continue. And so thank you very much indeed.